Look closer, the old man said. The gunsmith didn't look up. He had already made his assessment in under 30 seconds. And in a shop full of collectors and retired servicemen who had watched him work for years, he said what he thought out loud. The rifle was scrap. The receiver was corroded through. The stock was cracked at the wrist. No serial number on a gun in that condition was going to change what it was worth. The old man didn't argue. He stood at the counter, hands flat on the glass, and waited. Then he said, "Check that serial number." Some people spend a lifetime being told what something is worth before anyone bothers to look at it closely. This is a story about what happens when one man decides he has waited long enough. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Stay with me, because what that serial number unlocks goes deeper than anyone in that shop was ready for. The trigger pull on this one runs about 7 pounds, Nate Prebeck said, not looking up from the receiver. 7.25 maybe. Whoever stoned the sear last took off too much material. You're losing contact surface on the engagement. That's where your creep's coming from. Garrett Delusky leaned his forearms on the glass counter and studied the Springfield 1903 A3, the way he always studied things Nate explained to him, with the expression of a man who understood the conclusion without fully following the reasoning. He was 56, a deer hunter from Columbiana County who drove 90 minutes each way when he needed work done, and he had been coming to this shop for 11 years. "So you can fix it." "I can fix it." Nate set the rifle down on the counter mat, muzzle pointed at the far wall, and picked up a pen to write on the work order. "I'll take it down to about 4.5 pounds. Clean break, no creep. You'll feel the difference on your first shot." "How long?" "End of next week. I've got a Remington 700 ahead of you and a trigger job on a Browning that came in Tuesday." Garrett nodded and looked around the shop while Nate finished the paperwork. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early October, and the shop had the particular quality of light that came when the season turned, and afternoon sun came in low through the front windows, cutting across the glass display cases and throwing long rectangles of pale yellow across the worn wooden floor. The place smelled the way it always smelled. Hoppy's No. 9 solvent, faint in the air, underneath a layer of gun oil and old wood. The particular combination that Nate had long since stopped noticing, the way people stopped noticing the smell of their own houses. The shop was not large. 3 glass display cases ran along the front wall and down the left side, handguns visible under the glass. A row of revolvers, a collection of semi-automatic pistols arranged by manufacturer, 2 single-action revolvers in a corner case that were there more for atmosphere than for sale, their blued steel catching the afternoon light at low angles. Long guns lined the right wall on pegboard racks arranged loosely by type, bolt-action hunting rifles at the near end, semi-automatic sporting rifles in the middle, a handful of shotguns near the back. A short hallway behind the counter led to the workroom, where a bench vise and a set of action wrench blocks and a borescope monitor and 3 drawers of punches and picks and pin tools occupied the long table along the back wall, and where the smell of solvent was considerably stronger. There were 4 other people in the shop besides Nate and Garrett. A hunter in an orange vest stood at the ammunition wall near the far end, comparing 2 boxes of .308 Winchester with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic in his head. 2 collectors stood at the center display case, talking quietly about something under the glass, their voices low enough that only the register of them carried across the floor. And in the back, in a wooden chair with a cushion that had been there long enough to have compressed itself to the specific weight of the person who always occupied it, a Borisad Kahinde sat with a paper cup of coffee that had probably been hot an hour ago, reading something on his phone with the particular stillness of a man who was not really reading. Aborasade came in on Wednesdays. He had been coming in on Wednesdays for 6 years, ever since he moved back to Ohio after his wife's passing, and Nate had long since stopped trying to understand exactly what the man got out of it. He didn't buy anything most weeks. He drank his cold coffee and sat in his chair and occasionally said something that turned out to be important. And Nate had learned to wait when he felt that happening, the way you learn to wait when a man with more experience than you pauses before he speaks. Aborasade was 71, Nigerian-American, retired from 22 years in the Army, and he carried himself with the particular economy of motion that Nate associated with people who had spent a long time in professions where extra movement was a liability. He had arms that looked like they still remembered what to do, and a stillness about the face that made him difficult to read. And Nate had never seen him surprised by anything. Nate tore the customer copy from the work order and slid it across to Garrett. "I'll call you when it's done, probably Thursday of next week." Garrett folded the paper into his breast pocket, nodded once at the old man the way people nod at strangers in gun shops, and made his way to the door. The bell above the door made its flat sound. The old man had been in the shop for several minutes before this. Nate had noted his arrival and held up a finger, one moment, without interrupting the assessment he was finishing for Garrett. And the old man had taken a position at the counter and stood there with his hands flat on the glass and waited. He had the manner of someone who had done considerable waiting in his life and had made a certain peace with it. Not the impatient stillness of a person who is pretending to wait, the actual thing. He was carrying a rifle in a canvas slipcover, holding it against his side with the barrel pointed at the floor, the way anyone who knew anything about firearms carried a long gun in public. Nate turned his full attention to him now. "What can I do for you?" The old man unzipped the canvas slip and pulled the rifle out and laid it on the counter mat. He was very old. Nate registered this at close range in the particular way it registers with old men who don't look fragile. The skin at the temples, the white, close-cropped hair, the specific quality of deliberateness in the hands that spoke of decades of precision work or military habit, or both. He was dressed in gray trousers and a white button-down shirt with a dark tie, the kind of clothing that suggested a man who had dressed for an occasion without being able to articulate what the occasion was. He was dark-skinned in a way that Nate associated, without quite being able to say why, with West Africa. He had the posture of someone who had never in his life decided that it was acceptable to slouch. Nate looked at the rifle. He had been working on firearms since he was 17 years old. Apprentice to a gunsmith in Akron who had learned his trade from a man who had learned his from a man who had learned his before the Second World War. He had been running his own shop for 4 years. In that time, roughly 3,000 guns had come across his counter in varying states of condition, and he had developed the kind of visual assessment that happens faster than conscious thought. The eye taking in the whole object and returning a verdict before the brain is finished forming the question. The rifle was, at first reading, bad. Not bad in the sense of dangerous, which was a different assessment requiring different criteria. Bad in the sense of condition. The stock was a walnut that had been through weather, not once but repeatedly, over a long time, and had dried and cracked along the wrist where the wood met the action. A fracture line that ran for perhaps 3 inches and had been there long enough to have collected grime along its depth. The metal finish was gone from significant sections of the barrel and receiver, the underlying steel carrying the reddish-brown patina of surface rust that had been present long enough to etch into the metal rather than sitting on top of it. The muzzle crown was dinged in 2 places. The fiberglass handguard had a chip missing from the front edge the size of a thumbnail. The operating rod, visible at the right side of the receiver, had a slight warping to it that Nate noted without needing to pick the rifle up. The trigger guard showed the same corrosion pattern as the receiver. And the receiver itself, the main body of the gun, where the serial number lived, was covered in a uniform layer of old dust and oxide that had built up the way those layers build when a firearm has been stored without proper maintenance for a very long time. Years of it, possibly decades. It was an M14, military configuration, not the Springfield Armory Inc. M1A that civilians could purchase, but the actual military item. You could tell at a glance if you knew what to look for. The M1A had a slightly different receiver profile and carried Springfield's commercial markings in its own serial number format. The military M14 was a different object, built under government contract by Winchester, by TRW, by Harrington and Richardson, by the Springfield Armory before it closed in 1968. The receivers were marked differently. The geometry was slightly different. The manufacturing tolerances were different. Nate knew what he was looking at. He also knew what the rifle was worth in this condition, and the number was not high. He picked it up, left hand under the stock, right hand at the receiver, muzzle tilted slightly away from the old man across the counter, and turned it to examine the receiver. The operating rod moved with friction when he cycled it, the kind of gritty resistance that came from dried-out contact surfaces that hadn't seen lubrication in years. He checked the chamber, clear, and looked down into the action. The gas port area was fouled in a way that indicated sustained neglect rather than a single period of disuse. The piston was corroded at its face. He tilted the rifle to check the bolt, which moved roughly, the locking lug showing the same surface oxidation as everything else. He set it back down. "What are you looking to have done with this?" he said. "I want to know what it is," the old man said. "It's an M14. Nate set it down on the mat. Military configuration. The stock's cracked at the wrist, that line there, running back from the upper tang. That's not surface damage, that's structural. The wood is separated. The operating rod is slightly bent, which means any firing is going to give you extraction problems until that's replaced. The finish is gone from most of the metal surfaces. You've got active surface rust on the barrel and the receiver. The crown has taken impact damage in 2 spots, and the gas system is fouled past what a cleaning kit is going to address." He folded his hands on the counter. "Whoever owned this before you didn't store it properly. Left it somewhere with humidity cycling, probably no climate control. The rust isn't deep enough to compromise the bore. I'd have to run a bore light to confirm. But the restoration cost on something in this condition would run well past what the rifle is worth at the end of the process." The old man listened to all of this. He did not shift his weight or look away or show any of the small physical signs that people usually showed when they were hearing something they didn't want to hear about an object they cared about. He waited until Nate was finished, and then he said, "Look closer." One of the collectors at the center case had gone quiet. Not conspicuously quiet, just the way a room adjusts when a conversation has a different temperature than the surrounding air. Nate said, "I don't need to look closer to know what I've already told you. The condition is what it is. I can give you a full restoration estimate if that's what you're after, and I'll be honest about the numbers before we go any further. But in this state, as it sits right now, this rifle isn't worth what it would cost to bring it back." The old man said, "Then you're not looking at it." His voice was level, not angry, not wounded, not the voice of a man who had been insulted and was calibrating his response. Level in the way that certain people's voices are level when they are not performing calmness, but simply are calm. because whatever used to make them agitated in situations like this one stopped making them agitated a long time ago. There was something underneath the level quality that Nate could not immediately name. He would think about it later, and the word he would find was patience, but not the ordinary kind. The kind that has been tested enough times to have become structural. Nate looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the rifle. He had been running this shop for 4 years, and he had been in this trade for 12 before that. And he had a version of himself that existed in this shop that was confident in the way that competence produces confidence. Not arrogance exactly, but the ease of a man who had been right about his assessments often enough that he had stopped leaving much room for the possibility of being wrong. In a shop with collectors and veterans and people who knew guns, that ease was its own kind of currency. Garrett Dulesky drove 90 minutes each way. Aborisad Kahinde sat in his chair every Wednesday. The shop had a reputation, and the reputation was built on Nate's assessments, and Nate's assessment was what he had just delivered. The hunter at the ammunition wall was no longer focused on the boxes of .308. He was looking toward the counter, in the way people look when they are not quite willing to admit they are looking. His body still angled toward the shelf, but his attention clearly somewhere else. Nate said, "There's no serial number on a gun in this condition that's going to change what I just told you." He meant it as a closing statement, the kind that finished a conversation. He had said versions of it before to people who brought in damaged guns they had inherited or bought at estate sales, hoping that provenance or sentiment would alter the reality of metal and wood. History was history. Condition was condition. The two didn't always speak to each other. He reached for the slipcover, intending to put the rifle back and offer the old man a referral to a museum or a historical society, which was what he usually did when someone came in with something that was more artifact than firearm. The old man said, "Check that serial number." He didn't say it the way a man says something when he's losing an argument and has run out of points. He said it the way a man says something when he is the only person in the room who knows what the next 30 seconds is going to contain, and he has been patient enough to wait for them. Nate left the slipcover where it was. He reached under the counter for his flashlight, a compact tactical light he used for bore inspection and for working inside actions in the parts of the shop where the overhead lighting was insufficient, and clicked it on and brought the beam to the receiver. The supply tent on Firebase Kestrel smelled of diesel and canvas and the particular sweetness that wet red clay gives off when it starts to dry in heat. There was a generator running somewhere to the west. Emeka had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a sound that was there when you fell asleep. And through the tent's open flap, the eastern sky was beginning to shift from black to the color of old iron, which meant it was somewhere close to 5 in the morning. He was 23 years old, and he was alone in the tent, and he was checking a rifle manifest by flashlight. The flashlight was a standard military-issue angle headlamp fitted with a red filter, which was standard procedure for field work that needed doing without compromising night vision or advertising a position. The red light made the pages of the manifest look like something from a dark room, the typed columns appearing in shades of deep crimson and near black. He ran his thumb down the column slowly, feeling the slight physical ridge of each typed letter beneath the pad of his finger. He was a logistics advisor, assigned to the unit through a bilateral exchange program between the Nigerian Army and the United States Army that had been running quietly since the early 1960s. There were, at any given moment, roughly a dozen men in his position scattered across different commands in the theater, doing the work that logistics advisors did: tracking supplies, reconciling manifests, flagging discrepancies, ensuring that what the record said was present matched what was actually present. It was the kind of work that most people in a combat environment did not think about until it failed, at which point it became the most important work there was. His primary superior in the exchange program, a major named Okonkwo, who had sent him off from Lagos 8 months ago with a handshake and a numbered list of instructions, had told him one thing above all others. He had said it while looking at a manifest on a desk in an office in Lagos, pointing at a column of figures with the end of a pencil. The man who knows what is where, and who has what, and whether the count is right, that man is the one who determines what is possible. Never underestimate the power of an accurate number. Emeka had taken this seriously in the way that young men take seriously the words of people they intend to become. He had taken it seriously enough that he had developed habits around verification that some of the other men in the supply section found excessive. He checked every figure twice before he signed anything. He walked the inventory against the manifest rather than trusting either document alone. He had a system for flagging discrepancies that his predecessor had not used and that his successor would not use either, because it required considerably more effort than marking a column and moving to the next item. He flagged things that other people would have rolled over. He asked questions that other people had decided were not worth asking. In 8 months, this habit had identified 3 significant discrepancies in supply accounting that had materially affected the unit's operational readiness. The unit's executive officer had noted this in a report. Emeka had not seen the report. He had seen the corrected manifests, which was what mattered to him. The manifest he was working through tonight was the unit's small arms inventory, which he updated every 72 hours as weapons moved in and out of the supply section's accountability. Most of it was routine. M16A1s in various states of maintenance, the unit's crew-served weapons, the sidearms assigned to officers. But there was one item on the current page that was neither an M16A1 nor a standard sidearm, and it had been sitting in the supply tent's secure locker for 11 days, waiting for its paperwork to catch up to the physical object. He found the line. The rifle was an M14, national match configuration, field modified at some point prior to reaching the supply section, with a Leatherwood ART scope mount that had been installed by someone who understood what they were doing. The base was machine flush, the screws torqued correctly, nothing amateur about it. The ART scope itself was not on the rifle. It was in a separate padded transit case, cataloged on a different line of the manifest. The M14 serial number was on a property tag attached to the trigger guard, and Emeka verified the number on the tag against the number in the previous manifest entry by pulling the prior page from the back of the binder and holding both sheets under the angle head light together. They matched. He returned the prior page to the back of the binder and continued. The rifle had come to the unit's supply section through a chain of custody that the paperwork made look intentional, but which Emeka understood, having spent 3 days reconstructing it when the rifle arrived, to be the product of several separate administrative errors that had compounded into an accidental outcome. It had been pulled from a damaged and unserviceable equipment hold in Saigon, where it had been sitting since being turned in by a unit that was rotating out of theater. The turn-in paperwork listed it as a non-standard sniper configuration, condition fair, awaiting disposition determination. Someone at the damaged equipment hold had, instead of routing it through the standard disposal process, forwarded it to the unit supply section with a handwritten requisition note that was not, technically, a proper requisition. The note cited an operational requirement that may or may not have been real. Emeka had spent 3 days working out whether the note constituted an authorized transfer and had concluded, on the basis of a phone call to the division property officer, that it was sufficiently irregular to require documentation to legitimize retroactively, which he had then prepared. He understood the rifle's value as an object, independent of the paperwork questions. The National Match M14 was not the standard infantry M14. It was built to tighter manufacturing tolerances, hand-fitted at the Springfield Armory's match shop before that facility closed in April of this year, with a glass-bedded stock and a trigger group that broke clean at figures the standard military trigger could not reliably reach. The Leatherwood ART system that had been added in the field was a ranging telescope that allowed a shooter to dial in ballistic corrections through the scope's cam mechanism without breaking eye contact with the target. And it was being used in this theater by a small number of designated marksmen in a configuration that was not yet officially standardized, but was quietly regarded by people who understood long-range rifle work as being considerably more effective than what had preceded it. He knew the rifle's value because he had taken it out of the locker on the second day after it arrived and field stripped it on the supply table, because he was responsible for what was in this tent, and he made it his practice to understand what he was responsible for. He had run a bore light through the barrel. The M14's bore was clean, the rifling sharp through the lens, the chrome lining in good condition. He had checked the trigger pull with a borrowed spring scale and found it breaking at 3 pounds and 4 ounces, consistent with a national match fitting. He had worked the bolt by hand and found it cycling smoothly, the locking lugs engaging cleanly at their recesses. He had mounted the ART scope in its base and looked through it at the firebase's northern tree line, approximately 560 meters out by his map estimate, and found the glass clear and bright and the adjustment knobs moving with a precise positive detent feel. He was not a marksman by training. His firearms instruction had covered what was considered necessary for a logistics advisor in a military exchange program, which was substantially less than what a designated marksman received. But he had grown up hunting guinea fowl and francolins in the bush outside Kano with his uncle Adamu, who was a methodical teacher and an honest one about what shooting actually required. He could hold steady. He could read wind at moderate ranges. He could be patient, which was, his uncle had told him when he was 12 years old, the quality that separated the people who consistently hit things from the people who mostly missed. He logged the rifle on the manifest: serial number, configuration, condition rating, current location, custodian. He verified the entry against the physical tag, log it, then confirmed the log against the object, and reached into the locker and lifted the tag from the trigger guard and held it under the red light. The numbers matched. He returned the tag, closed the locker, initialed the manifest entry. Then, because it was his habit, he opened the locker again. He pulled the tag once more and read the serial number a second time against the manifest line, moving his thumb under each digit as he read it. His supervisor in Lagos had said, "Check it twice and you only cry once." He had said it in the context of a fuel manifest, making a point about the cost of transposing 2 digits in a column figure, but the principle applied everywhere. Emeka had taken the principle everywhere. The numbers matched. He returned the tag, closed the locker, signed the manifest page. He put the binder aside and sat for a moment in the half-dark of the tent, letting his eyes rest after 2 hours under the red light. Outside, the firebase was beginning to wake in the east, the iron-colored sky becoming something closer to gray, and he could hear the first sounds of the day separating themselves from the ambient noise of the night. Someone crossing the compound on the gravel path between tents, the distant clank of equipment being moved near the vehicle park, the flat voice of the operations radio working through a status check. He was thinking about the route. Specifically, he was thinking about the supply route from the fire base northwest toward the battalion's forward observation post, which was the route that had been flagged as potentially compromised in last evening's operations brief. He had walked that route the week before, not as security, but because a fuel delivery had encountered a problem at the second waypoint, and he had gone out with the driver to understand and resolve it in person. And he had direct knowledge of the road's current condition that was not reflected in the operations picture, because the operations picture was drawing on map data that was 6 weeks old, and the monsoon had rearranged 2 sections of the road in ways that were not on the map. He turned this over. The discrepancy between what the map said and what the road actually was would matter under normal operational conditions. Under conditions where the route might be actively contested, the discrepancy could matter considerably more. The relevant question was whether the specific sections of road that the monsoon had affected were the sections that would be used if the route came under pressure, and the unit needed to make a specific kind of movement. He concluded that they were. He picked up his notebook and wrote a short summary of what he knew about the road's current condition and where it differed from the operations picture, including the specific distances from the fire base to each section, and a note about the load-bearing capacity of the alternate crossing at the second waypoint. He underlined the alternate crossing note twice, because the operations sergeant was a man who responded to visual emphasis. He did not know, sitting in the half-dark with a notebook in his hand, that the note would matter in 46 hours in a way that would be extremely difficult to overstate. He did not know that a unit would be cut off from resupply with the route in question as their only viable extraction corridor, and that the operations picture would say the corridor was impassable when it was not, and that the piece of information he was writing in his notebook was the piece that would determine whether the corridor was used or abandoned. He did not know that in the same 46 hours, the rifle in the supply locker behind him would leave his custody under conditions that moved faster than the paperwork could track, issued out with a handwritten field sheet that would be lost before it could be properly filed. He did not know that the armorer, who told him afterward that the rifle would be returned through normal channels, was not lying when he said it, but was also not correct. He did not know that the rifle would go into the processing pipeline that rotated equipment out with the units, and that the pipeline would carry it to a facility where it would sit for years, and that the paperwork that could have followed it would not. He only knew that the sky was getting light, and that the manifest was correct, and that the note in his notebook was underlined twice, and that he had not slept in 20 hours, and that all of these things were equally true and equally his responsibility. He stood up, closed the notebook, picked up the manifest binder, and started toward the operations tent. In the shop, Emeka Durosinmi stood at the counter with his hands flat on the glass and watched the young gunsmith work the flashlight over the receiver. He had driven 40 minutes to get here. He had been in this shop once before, 2 months ago, when he had paid the estate intake price for the rifle in its canvas slipcover without explaining anything to the young man behind the counter, because there had been no reason to explain it yet. He had taken it home and spent 3 weeks in examination and verification before he had allowed himself to be certain. He had made 2 phone calls. He had written 1 letter to a woman named Violetta Marchevka, a retired military historian he had known through correspondence since 2009. And the letter had come back with documentary confirmation of what he already knew without needing to be confirmed. He was 88 years old. He had been carrying this particular knowledge in one form or another for 56 years, which was long enough that it no longer felt like weight. It felt like furniture in a room you had occupied so long that you had stopped noticing it. And then, when you decided to move it, you remembered how heavy it was. He had not come to the shop to make a scene. He was not interested in scenes, had never been interested in them. And the years had only strengthened his conviction that scenes accomplish considerably less than people hoped when they set them in motion. He had come to do one specific thing: establish the correct record. It was a practical objective. He was 88 years old, and the window for achieving practical objectives was not expanding. He watched the young gunsmith's face. The hunter at the ammunition wall had set one of his boxes of .308 down on the shelf. He was not looking at the shelf anymore. The two collectors had finished whatever they were discussing and were standing with the particular stillness of people who have decided to stay and see what a room is about to do. Aborasad Kahindi, in the chair near the back of the shop, had set his phone face down on his knee. His coffee was on the floor beside the chair. He was looking at the counter with an attention that was different from the attention of the other people in the room. More focused, less curious. The attention of a person who is watching for something specific rather than waiting to find out what happens. Emeka noticed Aborasad the way he noticed most things in a room, which was peripherally and accurately. He had no particular information about the man. He registered the bearing and the age and the quality of stillness and filed it without attaching a conclusion to it. The dust and oxide that had accumulated on the receiver were thick enough that the manufacturer's markings were partially obscured. The young gunsmith was doing what Emeka had asked him to do. He was wiping the receiver with a cloth, slowly, carefully, with the discipline of someone who understood that you did not scrub corroded metal surfaces if you wanted to preserve the material underneath. The cloth came away dark with each pass. He wiped again. The serial number on an M14 receiver lived on the right side, behind the operating rod handle, stamped into the metal in a format that varied slightly by manufacturer, but followed a consistent general pattern. Emeka knew the format. He had known it since he was 23 years old, alone in a supply tent before dawn, running his thumb down a manifest column under a red light. The number had not changed. Numbers, in Emeka's experience, did not change. What changed was whether people looked at them. The young gunsmith brought the flashlight close and read the digits aloud, automatically, the voice of a man transcribing rather than announcing. He read them to the end of the sequence. He was about to say something. Emeka could see the shape of it forming, something dismissive, something that would have closed the conversation in the direction it had been heading before. Something about the number not changing the condition of the rifle, which was technically accurate and entirely beside the point. Emeka said, "Check that serial number." Same words he had used before. He was not interested in new words. The words were not the point. The point was the second step, the one that came after reading a number aloud, the one that required a person to take what they had read and compare it against something larger than what they already knew. His supervisor had told him once, in an office in Lagos, with a pencil pointed at a column of figures, "The man who knows what is where and who has what and whether the count is right, that man is the one who determines what is possible." The young gunsmith had the flashlight on the receiver and the number was in the air of the shop. He had read it and he had not yet checked it, which meant he was standing at exactly the threshold that Emeka had driven 40 minutes to bring him to. The shop waited. Nate looked at the flashlight in his hand, and then at the receiver, and then at the old man across the counter. The old man's hands were flat on the glass. His face gave nothing away. He had the patience of someone who already knew what the next 30 seconds contained, and had decided that the most useful thing he could do was stand still and let those seconds arrive. Nate reached under the counter for his military archive database terminal. What that number connected to had been buried in a classified operations file for more than 50 years. What happened in the 46 hours that made the serial number worth anything at all, worth a 40-minute drive and a conversation that nobody in that shop was prepared for, is the part of this story that none of those people were ready to hear. Subscribe if you want to know how a number on a corroded receiver unravels a fraud that a regional museum has been displaying as history for 20 years. Part 2 is where the record starts to correct itself. The military archive database that Nate used was a subscription service maintained by a private research firm in Virginia that licensed declassified procurement records, unit equipment histories, and property accountability data from the National Archives, and from several service branch record centers that had digitized their holdings over the past 15 years. It was not comprehensive. Significant gaps existed in records from the Vietnam era, where paper manifests had been lost to fire, flood, administrative collapse, and the particular entropy of a war that had ended badly and quickly. But it was considerably more than nothing, and for a gun shop that dealt regularly in military surplus and estate sales involving military collections, it was useful enough to justify the monthly fee. Nate typed the serial number into the search field from memory, which was not something he normally did. Normally, he wrote numbers down before he entered them, old habit from the apprenticeship. Because transposing digits in a parts order cost money and time, and he had done it twice in his first year, and the memory was specific enough to have become procedure. He typed the serial from memory because the number was still in his mouth from reading it aloud, the digits in sequence like a short word in a language he didn't fully speak. He entered the search and waited. The terminal was a reconditioned laptop mounted on a shelf below the counter, positioned so he could see the screen while still facing the customer across the glass. The screen's light was cold against the warm afternoon coming through the front windows. 40 seconds. The service was not fast. It was pulling from multiple interconnected databases, and the search involved a cross-reference function that the firm had described in its documentation as proprietary, and that Nate understood simply as slow. Aborisad Kahinde, in the chair near the back of the shop, set his phone face down on his knee. The terminal loaded the result. Nate read it once. He read it again, which was not a habit he had with database results. Then he read the anomaly flag at the bottom of the entry, which was formatted differently from the primary result. A smaller font, a gray border around the text block, indicating a secondary cross-reference rather than a primary record. He straightened up. The entry identified the rifle's serial number as belonging to a National Match M14, manufactured at the Springfield Armory under a government contract dated 1966, issued through the Army's Marksmanship Training Unit, and subsequently transferred through a series of logistics handoffs to an embedded advisory element operating out of Firebase Kestrel in Military Region 3, Republic of Vietnam, in 1968. The operation associated with the rifle's last confirmed property entry was listed by its operational designation, 2 words, Winter Ledge. Below the operation name, a date range, 16 to 18 October 1968, and below that the name of the primary accountable individual on the property record at the time of the operation, which was the name of the person who had last signed the manifest. Emeka Durosinmi. Rank, Captain Equivalent, Exchange Assignment. Unit, Attached, Firebase Kestrel. Status of the item following the operation. Logged, lost in action. Physical recovery, not confirmed. Paperwork filed for property loss determination. Yes. Determination issued. Presumed unrecoverable. The anomaly flag below this read, Cross-reference query logged March 14, 2009 by external researcher. Serial number conflicts with accession record at Regional Museum. Name on file. Research query filed with NARA. No follow-up documented. The date on the anomaly flag was 17 years old. Nate looked up from the screen. Aborosade was standing. He had not stood up in the theatrical way, not with the suddenness of someone reacting to a noise or a sight. He had stood up the way a man stands when he has decided that sitting is no longer the right position for what is happening, which was a different and more deliberate thing. His coffee cup was on the floor beside the vacated chair. He was looking at the counter. His face was doing the careful thing it always did, the thing that Nate had come to understand as Aborosade's version of attention. Nothing moving on the surface, everything working underneath. The hunter at the ammunition wall had put both boxes of .308 back on the shelf. Nate said, "This says you were there." The old man said, "I know where I was." He said it the same way he had said everything else, without inflection that was designed to produce a specific effect, without the slight upward pressure of self-satisfaction that Nate would have expected from a man who was watching a younger person realize he had been wrong. He said it like a statement of geography. He knew where he had been. That was simply true, and had always been true, and the database confirming it did not make it more or less true than it had been before. Nate said, "Winter Ledge." Yes. The record says the rifle was logged lost in action. The record, Emeka said, was written by people who did not know where the rifle went after I last had it. Lost in action is what they write when they do not know. It does not mean what most people assume it means. One of the collectors had taken his phone out. The other one was looking at the screen behind the counter from an angle that probably didn't show him enough to read, but he was angling for it anyway. Nate turned the screen slightly without thinking about it, not to hide it, but because it was between him and the old man and he wanted the space clear. He said, "There's an anomaly flag on this record. A researcher tried to cross-reference this serial in 2009 against a museum's accession record." Emeka said, "Yes." The follow-up was never filed. No, it was not. The stillness of his face when he said that was a different kind of stillness from the patience he had shown during the assessment. It was the stillness of a man who has known a specific fact for a long time and has carried the weight of that fact in a specific part of his body, and has become so accustomed to the weight that he no longer notices it consciously, only notices its absence when someone else finally acknowledges the thing he has been carrying. Nate said, "Where did this rifle come from?" "The estate lot." Emeka said, "It went through 3 private sales between 1994 and last year. I can give you the documentation on each transfer if you need it." "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 4 years finding out." The crisis that became Winter Ledge began not with a firefight, but with a radio call that wasn't answered. Emeka was in the operations tent when the first indication came through, 44 hours after he had closed the supply tent binder and walked across the compound in the pre-dawn gray. He was reviewing a fuel consumption report with a supply sergeant named Tade, a compact man from outside Trenton who chewed the end of a pencil while he worked and left small crescent marks on every document that passed through his hands. When the operations radio at the far table went unanswered for a 4th consecutive attempt on a frequency that was supposed to have someone on it at all times, the operations sergeant, Woodbury, was the one who finally put a name to what the unanswered radio might mean. He did it carefully, the way experienced men in operation centers put names to things they would prefer not to be true, speaking in the conditional, covering each statement in the possibility that it was wrong, because naming a thing incorrectly in an operations context had consequences that naming it correctly also had, but different ones. He said the forward element at the observation post might be experiencing communications equipment failure. He said the last scheduled report had been 8 minutes ago. He said the route check was current as of yesterday's map update. Emeka looked at his notebook. He had written the summary of the route's actual condition 4 mornings ago, sitting alone in the supply tent. He had written it because it had seemed important, and he had intended to give it to Woodbury that same morning. And then a resupply vehicle had developed a fuel system problem at the motor pool, and he had spent the morning resolving that, and the notebook with the route summary in it had been in his shirt pocket for 4 days without being delivered to anyone. He said, "The route map is not current. The northwest section has changed." Woodbury looked at him. He said, 2 sections are impassable by vehicle as currently mapped. The monsoon took the crossing at waypoint 2. There is an alternate crossing 400 meters south that will take the load, but the approach grade is different from what the map shows. He said this carefully and factually, the way Major Okonkwo had taught him to say things in operational contexts, not with urgency that could be mistaken for alarm, and not with the flat affect that could be mistaken for uncertainty, but with the precision that indicated he knew what he was saying and had reason for saying it. Woodbury said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I walked it 6 days ago. Fuel delivery problem at waypoint 2. I went out with the driver." There were 3 seconds of the particular quality of silence that fills an operations center when a piece of information has arrived that is going to materially change something. Woodbury said, "Show me." What followed was not a battle. Emeka was not a combatant, and he never became one in the 48 hours that the after-action report would eventually refer to as the winter ledge period. He sat in the operations tent with his notebook open to the route summary and answered questions about the alternate crossing's grade and its load-bearing surface, and the specific distances from waypoint 2 to the position where the road surface improved enough to return to standard speed. And he answered these questions for 4 hours while the operations section worked the problem of a forward element that was cut off from its primary extraction corridor and needed to know that the corridor was not as cut off as the current picture suggested. He answered questions and he drank 3 cups of bad coffee, and he watched the operations sergeant's radio operator work through frequencies with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the answer would come when it came, and that the only correct response to that was to keep transmitting. And when the forward element finally came up on a secondary frequency 6 hours into the crisis, and the connection between the route's actual condition and the unit's viable options became a matter of minutes rather than hours, Emeka was the person in that tent who knew the specific numbers that turned an impassable corridor into a possible one. He did not fire a weapon. He did not move from the tent. He was the man with the correct manifest, which was the thing Major Okonkwo had said he was always preparing to be. And he was that man at the moment when the manifest was the thing that mattered most. The rifle was gone from the supply locker when he returned to the supply tent that evening. There was a field chit in its place, handwritten on a slip of supply form paper, citing an emergency field issue to a designated marksman element that had been attached to the firebase temporarily and was departing with the extraction movement. The field chit was signed by the armorer, a man named Kupke, whose handwriting Emeka knew from 3 months of countersigning resupply forms, and whose signature looked exactly like what it was, something written in a hurry, under conditions where hurrying was the correct response. Emeka read the chit, noted the serial number, initialed the copy, and filed it with a flag indicating that a property accounting follow-up was required. He did not think about this as a loss. He thought about it as a transfer pending documentation, which was what it technically was. He expected the documentation to follow. He thought about it in those terms for several months, during which the documentation did not follow. And then the unit rotated out, and Emeka's exchange assignment ended, and he spent 6 weeks in Lagos writing reports that nobody had specifically asked for about logistics procedures in the theater. And then a year later, he was in the United States for graduate study in public administration at Ohio State. And by then the question of the rifle had become something he kept in a specific part of his mind, where he put things that were unresolved but not currently addressable. He kept it there for a long time. In the shop, Violetta Marchevka had been quiet for 12 minutes. This was not unusual for her. She was the kind of person who contributed to conversations in proportion to what she actually knew about the subject under discussion, which in most conversations meant she said considerably less than other people expected, and in conversations about military history meant she said considerably more than other people were prepared for. She was 67, Polish-American, a retired professor of military history from a state university 40 miles north of Columbus, and she came to the shop because she was writing a monograph on the proliferation of military small arms into the civilian market through the post-Vietnam Army's equipment disposal pipeline, and the shop's owner allowed her to look at anything that came through the estate intake in exchange for the occasional identification of something the estate's family couldn't place. She had been sitting at the small table near the back of the shop, not a Borisade's chair, the table against the left wall where she usually spread her notebooks and her laptop, when Emeka had set the rifle on the counter. She had looked up at the sound of the canvas slip being unzipped, because she listened for that sound the way someone writing a monograph about a specific type of object listens when one appears. And she had seen enough of the rifle's surface condition to make a preliminary assessment of era and type before Nate had made his. She had not said anything because Nate was doing his job, and her assessment was not going to add anything to what he would determine by handling the rifle directly. And because she was not in the habit of offering opinions when a process was underway that would produce its own conclusion. When Nate had read the serial number aloud, she had picked up her phone. She had not looked up from the phone since then. She was running a search that she had been waiting since March 2009 to be able to run properly, which was the month when she had filed her own query against the NARA database about a serial number that had appeared as a footnote in an after-action summary she was reading for a different project entirely. A summary of the Winter Ledge period that had been partially declassified as part of a 2008 records review, in which the Logistics Advisor's field report was quoted in summary form, in which a serial number appeared in the citation as the property accountability item associated with the advisor's manifest. She had filed the query. The query had returned a museum accession record that didn't fully match the record it claimed to match. She had written a letter to the museum. The museum had responded politely that their provenance had been independently verified by an outside conservator at the time of acquisition, and that they were confident in their documentation. She had written one more letter. It had not been answered. She had written a note to herself in the margin of the after-action summary. Follow up on the serial number discrepancy. And then the project she was working on had moved into a different period, and the note had stayed in the margin, and 17 years had passed. The database she was currently searching on her phone was the museum's own online collection catalog, which they had digitized and made publicly available in 2019. She had found the display rifle within 4 searches. She was looking at the catalog entry's detail page, which included the accession number, the acquisition date, the donated by field, the condition notes, and the provenance description. Then she pulled up the scan of the accession form she had in her own research files. The form she had obtained through an institutional request in 2009, which the museum had provided as part of their polite response to her first letter. She had been thorough enough 17 years ago to have retained the scan. The serial number on the catalog page's detail entry did not match the serial number on the accession form scan. They were close. They differed by 2 digits in the middle of the sequence, a transposition that would look like a typographical error to anyone who was not specifically comparing the 2 documents side by side, with reason to be looking for a discrepancy. She had noticed it in 2009. She was looking at it again now. She was also looking at the provenance description on the catalog page, which identified the rifle as having been acquired from a private collector in 2003, who had purchased it at an armory decommissioning sale in 1994. The 1994 sale was a documented event. She had the sale records in her research files because it had been the subject of a chapter in the monograph she was currently writing. The armory in question was one of several that had been closed in the early 1990s as part of the post-Cold War defense infrastructure reduction, and its equipment disposal had been managed through the standard Army property disposition process, which was supposed to include a final reconciliation of accountability records before items entered the civilian market. She was looking at the sales item list on a secondary search now, pulling it from a digitized archive she had accessed as part of the monograph research. The rifle from the 1994 sale that the museum's provenance cited as the origin of their display piece was listed with a serial number. She compared it against the number she had in 3 other places: the catalog page, the accession form scan, and the number Nate had read aloud from the receiver across the shop. Only one of these matched the number on the 1994 sales item list. It was not the number on the museum's catalog page. Violetta looked up. She said, "Their rifle is the fake." She said it in the particular register that Nate had heard from her before in conversations about historical objects, the register of precision, which sounded in her voice not like accusation, but like the announcement of a measurement. Here is what the instrument says. She was not satisfied about this. She was certain about it, which was a different thing. The room had changed again. Not dramatically. It was not a room that did things dramatically, because most of the people in it were people who had been in situations where dramatic responses to information were a liability. But the quality of attention had shifted in the way that attention shifts in a room where a significant statement has just been made by a person who has the credentials to mean it. The hunter near the ammunition wall had come several steps closer to the counter without appearing to decide to do so. One of the 2 collectors had taken a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket, not to read anything, but in the way people reach for familiar objects when they need a moment. Aborisad was still standing. He had not moved since he stood up. He was looking at Violetta now, with the same quality of specific attention he had been directing at the counter. Nate said, "How certain are you?" Violetta said, "I'm looking at 4 different numbers. 3 of them are supposed to be the same number. 2 of them actually are. The 2 that match are this rifle." She tilted her phone toward the counter without looking up from the screen. "And the sale record from 1994. The museum's catalog number was entered differently from their own accession form, which means the discrepancy is internal to their documentation. And the number on their form doesn't match the sale record either. She paused. Somebody changed a number. I don't know when and I don't know who. But the rifle they are currently displaying as a documented piece from Winter Ledge is cataloged with a serial that matches no primary source I can find. She set the phone face up on the table and looked at Nate. Then she looked at Emeka. The query I filed with NARA about this serial was in 2009, she said. I sent a letter to the museum. They told me their provenance was verified. Emeka said, I received a copy of that letter. She looked at him. He said, the researcher who filed the query sent me a notice because my name was in the after-action citation. I wrote to the museum also. My letter was not answered. Violetta said, neither was mine, the second one. A pause. The late afternoon light through the front windows had shifted since Emeka had first set the rifle on the counter, moving from the pale rectangular blocks it had thrown across the floor when Nate was finishing the Springfield assessment, to something lower and more orange now, the kind of light that appeared for a short time in October at this latitude before the sun dropped behind the neighborhood's roof lines and the shop's interior fell back on its overhead fluorescence. Emeka said, in 1995, a private buyer purchased the rifle at the armory sale and held it until 2001, when it was sold to a second party through an estate transaction in Pennsylvania. The second party held it for 9 years and sold it to a collection dealer in 2010. The collection dealer offered it to the museum in 2012. The museum declined, saying they already had a documented example. The collection dealer sold it privately in 2014 to a man in West Virginia who had no understanding of what he had and who included it in his estate lot when he died last year. He paused. The estate lot came to this shop. Nate said, you paid $240 for it. Yes. You knew what it was when you bought it. I knew what the serial number was. I came back when I had confirmed what the serial number meant. Nate looked at the rifle on the counter. The receiver was cleaner where he had wiped it down. The dust was gone from the immediate area around the serial, and the metal under the cleared surface was what it was, oxidized and pitted in the way of metal that had been neglected for decades. But the stamp was legible in a way it hadn't been when the rifle was first laid on the mat. The digits sat in their stamped channels in the metal without ambiguity. They were not going to change. They had not changed since 1966. He said, the museum in their display has a rifle with a different number. Yes. Which means the one on display is either misidentified or it was deliberately assigned a different number to make it match a record. Violetta said, based on what I have in front of me, the serial on their display piece matches no documented item in any primary source I have accessed, which is consistent with the second of your two options. Nobody said anything for a moment. The hunter had put his hand on the front display case, not leaning on it, just resting, the way a person makes contact with a solid object when they need something steady. One of the collectors had taken his reading glasses back off and was holding them. Aborsad was still standing, and he was very still, and his face was doing the careful thing. The first time Emeka found the museum's catalog online, he was 64 years old, and it was a Thursday evening in January, and he was sitting at a desk in his home office in Columbus with a cup of tea going cold beside the keyboard. He had not been looking for the museum. He had been looking for the after-action summary, which had been partially declassified in 2008 and had appeared in a reference list in an article about the advisory program that he had found through a search that had started somewhere else entirely. He had clicked through to the article because his name was cited in a footnote, which had happened occasionally over the years. The Winter Ledge period was not widely known, but it was known in certain narrow circles of military history, and the logistics advisor's role in it had been acknowledged in the partial after-action summary in terms that were specific enough to be clearly about him, without being dramatic about it. He had read the article. He had clicked through to the after-action summary. He had read the summary in a way that was different from the way he had read things about this period before, more carefully, more slowly, with the attention of someone who is looking for a specific thing rather than reading for general comprehension. He found the citation of the manifest and the serial number. He wrote the serial in a notebook, though he did not need to write it because the serial was a thing he had not needed to write down since 1968. He searched the serial. The museum's catalog came up on the second search. He looked at the catalog entry for a long time. The photograph on the catalog page showed a rifle in a display case under controlled museum lighting, horizontal, mounted on two acrylic supports, the receiver facing the camera. A placard below the rifle with typed text too small to read in the image. The rifle in the photograph was an M14. The catalog description cited it as a national match configuration, documented field use example associated with Operation Winter Ledge, acquired through donation from a private collector who had purchased it from a documented armory disposal event. He read the serial number in the catalog entry. He read it again. He had a way of double-checking numbers that was 50 years old and that he used automatically, without deciding to use it, because it was a habit so deep it had become reflex. Read the number once with the eye moving left to right at normal pace, then read it again right to left, digit by digit, treating each digit as an independent item. The second reading, backward, caught transpositions that the forward reading let through because the forward reading was too close to the experience of reading a word, where the brain completed familiar sequences before the eye finished them. He read the museum's serial number forward. He read it backward. He put his pen down on the desk. The number in the museum's catalog did not match the number he had carried in his memory since he was 23 years old in a supply tent in Military Region 3, reading a rifle manifest by red flashlight while outside the fire base came light. He sat with this for a long time. The tea was cold. The house was quiet. His wife Necca had been gone for 2 years by then, and the quiet of the house was still something he was in the process of adjusting to. Though he had been told that you adjusted to it the way you adjusted to any permanent condition, which was by finding a way to stop calling it an absence and start calling it a quality. He sat with the fact of the wrong number. Then he began to work. He wrote to the museum first. He wrote a careful, factual letter citing the after-action summary and his role in the manifest, providing his full name and his exchange assignment designation and the serial number as he had it in his records, and requesting a comparison against their accession documentation. He wrote it on letterhead from the consulting firm he had retired from 5 years before, because letterhead was a signal that the person writing was not writing impulsively. The museum's response came 3 weeks later. It was professional and polite and completely closed. Their provenance had been verified by an outside conservator at acquisition. They were confident in their documentation. If he had additional information he wished to submit for consideration, there was a form on their website for artifact-related correspondence. He filled out the form. The form's response was automated. He did not hear from the museum again. He found Violetta Marchevka through the NARA cross-reference query flag in 2009. A different researcher had sent him a notice that his name had appeared in a related query, and the query was attributed to Violetta by institution affiliation. He wrote to her. She wrote back the same week. They exchanged documents, her 2009 accession form scan, his copy of the original manifest pages from the unit's records that he had obtained through a FOIA request in 1998. The documents said the same thing from different directions. Violetta wrote in her last letter that she had written a second time to the museum and had not received a response. She wrote that she had a monograph to finish and could not dedicate more time to the question in the immediate term, but that she believed the discrepancy was real and significant, and that if the opportunity to address it properly arose, she would. She wrote that she was sorry she could not do more. He wrote back. He said he understood. He said he was patient. This was true. He was patient in the way he had always been patient, because the alternative was anger, and anger required energy. And he had a specific economy of energy that he had been developing since he was a young man in a supply tent. And spending it on anger was a transaction he had decided long ago was not worth the cost. He kept looking. The trail through the 3 private sales took 4 years of intermittent correspondence, records requests, and the assistance of a researcher friend at Ohio State who was willing to work through the armory sale records as a professional favor. The friend found the 1994 sale lot. Emeka found the buyer's name in a state property records database. He wrote to the buyer's estate. The man had died in 2002, and the estate had no documentation to offer but confirmed that the man had owned a collection and had sold parts of it before his death. A sale record from 2001 showed a transfer to a buyer in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania buyer was traceable through a gun show transaction database that the researcher's institution subscribed to. The collection dealer in 2010 was traceable because he had applied for a federal firearms license, and the license was public record. Each step took time. He was patient. The West Virginia estate lot he found through an online search of estate sale listings, which he checked periodically, which most people who knew him would not have expected an 84-year-old man to do, and which was simply something he did because it was necessary, and because the tools to do it existed, and because he had spent 50 years understanding how things got lost, and had concluded that the primary mechanism was that people stopped looking. He had paid $240 and driven 40 minutes home, and spent 3 weeks in his study going through what he had before he was certain enough to come back. Emeka reached into his breast pocket. He had touched whatever was in there twice since he arrived at the shop. Once when he first set the rifle on the counter, a small reflexive contact, the hand going briefly to the pocket and then returning to the counter glass without bringing anything out. Once again while Nate was running the database search, the same gesture, the same return. If anyone in the shop had noticed it, they had not indicated so. He reached in now and brought out a photograph. Not an envelope, not a folded document, just the photograph. The way a person carries a photograph that has been in the same pocket for a long time. The edges worn, the surface slightly bowed from body heat and pressure. The kind of handled quality that is specific to objects that have been taken out and looked at and put back many times over many years. He set it on the counter beside the rifle. He didn't announce it. He didn't frame it. He set it down and moved his thumb away from it the way you set something down when you have been carrying it long enough that the carrying is no longer something you do consciously, only the setting down. The photograph was black and white. It showed a young man in field clothes standing in front of what appeared to be a supply tent or a storage structure, in direct sunlight that flattened the shadows and gave the image a high contrast quality. He was holding a rifle in his right hand, muzzle down, stock resting on the ground beside his right boot, in the relaxed posture of someone who carries a firearm comfortably and is not posing with it but simply holding it because it was in his hand when the photograph was taken. The rifle in the photograph was an M14. The receiver was facing the camera at a slight angle, not straight on, which would have shown the full length of the serial, but at an angle that compressed it slightly. In the upper third of the serial's digit sequence, 4 digits were clearly legible. They matched the first 4 digits of the number that Nate had read aloud from the rifle on the counter, and that the database had returned in its result. The young man in the photograph was clearly the old man standing at the counter. Not approximately, clearly. The bone structure was the same, the posture was the same, the quality of stillness in the face was the same. 65 years were visible in the comparison, the way 65 years are always visible when you put a young face and an old face in proximity and understand them to be the same person. Visible in the skin and the hair and the weight around the eyes, but the face was the same face without question or ambiguity. Nate looked at the photograph. He looked at the rifle on the counter. He looked at the old man standing across the glass from him. Emeka's hands were at his sides. He was not watching the room. He was watching Nate, in the particular way that people watch someone when they need to know which direction that person is going to move. Not demanding, not anxious, but attentive in the way that requires you to be still enough to see clearly. The shop was quiet in the specific way that shops are not usually quiet. The hunter had not moved in several minutes. The 2 collectors were no longer pretending to be interested in anything under the glass. Violetta had her phone face down on the table. Aborisade was standing, and his face had settled into something that Nate could not fully read and was not going to try to read, because whatever was in Aborisade's face was a private matter that the older man had not invited him to interpret. Nate did not say anything. There was a long moment where the only sound was the faint traffic noise from the street outside and the low hum of the refrigerator unit in the back room that Nate had been meaning to have looked at for 3 months because it ran a degree warmer than it should, and he kept forgetting between Tuesday and the following week. Nate looked at the photograph. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the old man. The afternoon light through the front windows had gone flat, the sun dropping fully behind the roof line, and the shop's overhead fluorescents had taken over in their impersonal way, washing the counter in a light that showed everything clearly and rendered nothing warmly. The rifle's receiver under that light was corroded and pitted and real. The photograph was worn at the edges and real. The old man's face was 88 years old and patient and real. Nate looked at all 3 of these things. He did not speak because he was in the moment just before the space between understanding a thing and deciding what to do with the understanding closes. And nothing he could have said in that moment would have been the right thing to say. And some part of him that was more precise than his professional confidence understood this and kept him quiet. If you've ever found yourself in a room where the truth was finally sitting in plain sight after years of being somewhere else, you know what that silence sounds like. Part 3 is where the record gets corrected, and where this story arrives at the only place it was ever headed. It's there when you're ready. Nate moved first, not toward the phone and not toward the old man. He moved toward the rifle, picking it up from the counter mat with the left hand under the stock and the right hand at the receiver, the same 2-point carry he had used when he first examined it, and he turned it to look at the serial number under the overhead fluorescence with the flashlight off. The number was legible without the flashlight now. He had cleared enough of the surface oxide during his earlier examination that the stamped digits sat in their channels clean and unambiguous. The way stamped metal looks when you remove what is accumulated on top of it and find that the mark underneath was made by a process that was designed to outlast the conditions it would face. He looked at the number for a long time. Then he set the rifle back down on the mat with the same care he had used picking it up, muzzle toward the far wall, receiver facing up. He moved it slightly so that it was parallel to the counter's edge rather than at the diagonal it had shifted to during his examination. The adjustment was small enough that no one watching would have been able to say with certainty whether it was intentional or automatic. It was intentional. He said, "What do you need from me?" The old man said, "I need two things. The museum's record corrected. The rifle placed in the memorial on Prospect under the correct name and provenance." He said this the way he had said everything else, without preamble, without the slight performance of a man announcing a decision he is proud of. He was describing an objective. He had been describing objectives in the same flat, precise register since before Nate Prebeck was born, and the register had not changed. Nate said, "You've already arranged the memorial. I've written to them. They are waiting for the rifle and the documentation. I told them I would bring the documentation when I had what I needed from here." "What documentation do you have?" Emeka said, "The original manifest pages from the unit's supply records, obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 1998. The field chit that went into the locker when the rifle was issued out, which I retained a copy of at the time. A letter from the Division Property Office confirming the property loss determination filed in 1969. Photographs from the period, including this one." He indicated the photograph on the counter without touching it. "A correspondence file spanning 2009 to this year, including letters to the museum, the NARA query, and Professor Marchevka's accession form scan." He paused. "And the rifle itself, with the serial number, is stamped." Violetta at the table near the left wall said, "I can add a formal historian statement. I can have it to you in 48 hours. Emeka looked at her. He said, "Thank you, Violetta." It was the first time he had used her name in the shop, which meant they had corresponded long enough that her name was the natural form of address, not Professor Marchevka, not ma'am, but Violetta, the way you address someone you know through letters that were serious enough to have established a specific kind of trust, even without physical presence. She gave a short nod and picked up her phone and began composing something, which was her way of indicating that the conversation had moved from the question of what needed to be done to the process of doing it, and she was already in the process. Nate said, "The museum." He said it not as a question, but as a thing he was naming before he addressed it. He had picked up the shop's main phone, a landline, a decision he had made when he opened the shop on the basis that it sounded more professional than a cell phone ringing in a customer's ear, and was looking at it in his hand. "I know the curator there," he said. "Not well, but we've had contact. They sent a Springfield carbine through last year for condition assessment before they added it to the collection, and I did the assessment. The man I talked to was named Hendricks." He set the phone back down. He was not picking it up yet. He was working through something in the way that people work through something when they can see what needs to happen, but are not quite at the moment of beginning it. He looked at Emeka. He said, "I was wrong about the rifle." He said it without the qualifications that the statement could have supported, without the explanatory framework of condition and expertise and the limits of visual assessment, all of which were real and would have been fair to introduce. He said it the way someone says a thing when they have decided that the thing is true and the qualifications are beside the point. Emeka said, "You saw what the rifle showed you. It shows that to everyone." "That's not the same as an excuse." "No," Emeka said, "it is not." He said it without inflection that made it an accusation, and without inflection that made it a forgiveness. He said it as a fact about the distinction between an explanation and an excuse, which was a distinction he had spent 88 years maintaining in his own thinking, and which he was not going to blur on someone else's behalf simply because the acknowledgement had been offered. The distinction mattered. The young man across the counter understood it mattered, which was why he had not offered the qualifications. Emeka recognized this, and it was the thing that made the conversation different from what it might have been. Nate picked up the phone and dialed. The call took 11 minutes. No one in the shop said anything during those 11 minutes. The hunter had not gone back to the ammunition wall. He was standing near the front display case with his arms crossed, not in a hostile posture, but in the way people stand when they are holding still for a length of time and need something to do with their arms. The two collectors were at the center case, one of them with his reading glasses folded in his shirt pocket now, the other one studying the floor with the attention of a man thinking rather than looking. Violetta was writing on her phone, her thumb moving steadily across the screen, composing the historian's statement in the particular methodical way she composed professional documents. From the credential statement down through the factual assertions to the conclusion, each piece in its proper place. She paused twice to verify something in her research files, which she navigated without looking away from what she was writing. The efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. Aborosade was standing. He had been standing since before Violetta said their rifle is the fake, and he showed no sign of returning to his chair. He was watching the back of Nate's head as the younger man stood turned slightly away from the counter, speaking into the phone in a voice low enough that the words weren't carrying clearly across the shop. The posture of the call was visible even without the words, the slight forward lean of someone making an uncomfortable statement, the brief pause that indicated the person on the other end was responding, the measured second statement that followed the pause, the longer silence that followed that one. Emeka stood at the counter. His hands were at his sides now, not on the glass. The photograph was on the mat beside the rifle where he had set it. He was not looking at either of these things. He was looking at a middle distance, somewhere above the display cases on the left wall, at a particular angle that put his gaze on the space between the overhead fluorescent fixture and the top of the pegboard rack, which was a space that contained nothing. It was the gaze of someone whose attention is somewhere other than the room they are standing in, without being the vacant gaze of a person who is checked out. He was present. His attention was elsewhere. These were not contradictory. The overhead lights in the shop produced a low, continuous hum that was below the threshold of conscious hearing in ordinary circumstances, and that became audible in extraordinary circumstances the way ambient sounds always did. Traffic noise, refrigerator hum, the specific frequency of fluorescent ballasts in an older fixture. Emeka had been in enough silences of this particular kind to know that the hum was always there, and that noticing it now was simply a function of the room's attention having gone somewhere that made the background audible. Nate said something into the phone that carried a different quality from the statements that had preceded it. Not louder, more final. The way a conversation ends when the person ending it has said what was necessary and is not interested in extending it past that. He lowered the phone and set it on the counter. He said, "Hendricks is going to pull the accession records and review them against what Violetta found." He said the word review in a way that indicated he was aware that review was the minimum response to the situation, and that the situation may require more than the minimum. He paused. He also said something about the provenance verification process being the responsibility of the conservator they contracted at acquisition time, and not an internal museum function, which I took to mean he was beginning to work out where the accountability sits before the conversation gets more formal. Violetta said, without looking up from her phone, "That is what it means." Nate said, "He knows this is going to require a formal correction to their display documentation. He said he would need to see the primary source materials." "I'll send them today," Violetta said. "I'll send the assessment," Nate said. "Serial number, physical condition, the database result, the cross-reference flag." He pulled a legal pad from under the counter and began writing. His handwriting was small and even. The handwriting of someone who had spent years writing small on parts labels and work orders where space was a constraint and legibility was non-negotiable. He wrote without stopping, the pen moving steadily down the page. Emeka watched him. There was something in watching the young man write that Emeka recognized from other moments in a life that had contained a considerable number of moments where a record was being set right. The particular quality of a person who has understood what is required and is simply doing it, without the performance of virtue and without the resentment of a person who is doing something they were told to do. Nate was writing because the record needed to be correct, and because he had the information to make it correct, and because those two facts were sufficient reason. The assessment he had made of the rifle an hour ago was also a record, of a kind. That record was wrong. He was correcting it. This was the same process he applied to any error in his work. Emeka did not find this insufficient. He had spent a long time understanding that the measure of whether a person could be trusted was not whether they made errors, but whether they corrected them when they had the means to do so. Most people, given the choice between admitting a mistake and finding a way to let the mistake stand, chose the latter. The ones who didn't were the ones worth staying in a room with. He was still in this room. The room had not asked him to leave, and he had not decided to leave. This was itself a kind of answer to a question that had been implicit in the conversation since the beginning. There was a supply route northeast of Firebase Kestrel that ran along a ridge for a kilometer before dropping into a shallow river crossing and then climbing again on the far side toward the observation post. Emeka had walked it in June of 1968 on a Tuesday morning, following a fuel delivery problem at the second waypoint, and had spent 40 minutes at the alternate crossing 400 meters south of the primary, confirming with a load-bearing assessment that the alternate surface would take a 3/4-ton vehicle at reduced speed. He had made marks in his notebook. He had measured the approach grade with a hand clinometer borrowed from the unit's engineer section. He had walked the far approach twice, checking the surface for soft spots that would not be visible in photographs or on maps. He had done this because it was his responsibility to know what the routes were actually like, as distinct from what the maps said they were like, and because Major Okonkwo's instruction about accurate numbers extended naturally to accurate routes. Since a route was only another kind of accounting, what was passable, where, by what kind of vehicle, under what conditions. He had not known when he walked the route that the information would matter. He had known that accurate information always mattered, which was different from knowing that a specific piece of accurate information would be used in a specific crisis at a specific moment. The knowing in general and the knowing in specific were not the same kind of knowing, and he had been careful over the course of his life not to conflate them, because conflating them produced a person who thought his past decisions were more intentional than they were, and a person who thought his past decisions were more intentional than they were was a person who had stopped learning from the ways in which accuracy was also luck. The note he wrote in the operations tent during Winter Ledge was accurate. What the note enabled was real. He had spent 56 years neither inflating the account of his role nor diminishing it, because both distortions were forms of inaccuracy, and he had a professional and personal commitment to accuracy that did not admit of exceptions for things he was personally involved in. He had been the man with the correct manifest. He had given the right information to the right person at the right time. The people who came out of that corridor came out of it in part because the information was right. This was what it was. He had not needed it to be more. What he had needed and had not received was for the record to be correct. Not for his name to be celebrated. For the record to say what happened, accurately, in the way that records were supposed to say what happened, so that what happened could be known by the people who needed to know it, and so that the objects associated with what happened were identified correctly and placed correctly, and treated as what they were, rather than as what someone had decided was close enough. The museum's rifle was not close enough. The museum's serial number was not close enough. Close enough was the mechanism by which things got permanently wrong, and Emeka had been opposing close enough in supply manifests and property records and administrative correspondence for his entire professional life. He had retired from that professional life. He had not retired from opposing close enough. Nate finished writing and looked up. He said, "The memorial. What do they have capacity for in terms of documentation?" Emeka said, "A placard, a mounting case, and a photograph. They have a format for documented pieces. The placard carries the name, the dates, the operation designation, and the serial number. The photograph you brought, a reproduction. I'm providing the original to the State Archive as part of a donation of the full correspondence file. The reproduction is sufficient for display." Nate nodded. He looked at the legal pad, then at the rifle. He said, "Before it goes to the memorial, do you want it cleaned?" He said it the way he said things about firearms in a professional context, direct, specific, without sentimentality around the object and without the pretense that the question didn't have a right answer depending on what the object's owner intended for it. Cleaning a rifle before permanent display was a decision with implications for the object's long-term condition. Not cleaning it was also a decision. He was asking which decision Emeka wanted to make. Emeka said, "The surface corrosion. Nothing that would alter what's already there. I can neutralize the active rust and apply a preservation coat without touching the patina. Whatever's already in the metal stays. The bore I'd want to clean and oil. If it's going to be in a case long term, the bore needs to be clean and protected. But visually, what you see now is what you'll see after." "Yes," Emeka said, "do that." He said it with the trust of a person who has assessed someone's competence and found it sufficient. Not the trust of a person who is feeling generous, but the trust of a person who has watched someone work and concluded that the work is what it should be. He had watched Nate handle the rifle twice now, and both times the handling had been correct. Proper two-point carry, muzzle discipline, bolt check on pickup. The assessment had been wrong, but the craft underneath the assessment was sound. These were separable things. Nate moved the legal pad aside and set the rifle on the counter mat again. He went to the back room and they could hear him opening cabinet doors, the specific sounds of a person who knows exactly where everything is and moves through a space at the speed that familiarity allows. He came back with a small wooden tray holding several items: a bore cleaning rod in sections, a collection of patches, a small bottle of bore solvent, a separate bottle of preservation oil, a pair of cotton gloves, and a collection of small picks and cotton swabs. He put on the gloves. He began to work. The shop had a sound when work was being done in it, different from its sound when commerce was being conducted or conversation was occurring. The sound of work was quieter and more regular, the small percussions of metal against cloth, the particular soft sound of a patch moving through a bore at controlled pressure, the occasional click of a pick against a metal surface. Nate worked the bore in sections, running a solvent patch the length of the barrel and following it with a dry patch, checking the patch on return, running again. The patches came back dark and then darker before they began to lighten. He ran them until they came back clean enough to satisfy the criterion he was applying, which was not the criterion for a rifle that was going to be fired, but the criterion for a rifle that was going to be stored, which was different and more specific in some ways and less demanding in others. The shop watched him work without calling attention to the watching. The hunter had sat down on the low bench along the front wall, below the window where the daylight was now fully gone, and the street outside had gone dark in the way that October evenings went dark in this part of Ohio, early and without much transition. He had his jacket on his knee. He was not going anywhere and did not appear to be in a hurry to go anywhere. This was not a decision he had made explicitly. It was simply what he was doing. The two collectors had reached the point of standing, where standing had become the natural state, where they would have felt the need to make a decision if they had started to leave. One of them had gone back to the center display case, but was not looking at anything under the glass. He was resting his hands on the top of the case and looking at the counter where Nate was working. Violetta had finished composing on her phone and had opened a laptop from the bag beside her table. She was working in the fast, quiet way she worked when she was in source material, pulling documents, reading quickly, moving on. She was building the historian's statement. It would be thorough, and it would be correct in the way that statements from people of her training and standard were correct, which was not the same as the correctness of a property manifest, but was its counterpart in a different domain. And Emeka had been grateful for the correspondence with her since 2009, precisely because she occupied the domain of historical documentation the way he had occupied the domain of logistical accounting, with a commitment to accuracy that was not a personality trait so much as a professional identity, the kind that survived retirement. Aborasade had finally moved. He had not returned to his chair. He had crossed to the front of the shop, and he was standing approximately 2 feet to Emeka's left, close enough that their shoulders were nearly in contact. He was looking at the counter, at the rifle, at the photograph, at Nate's gloved hands moving over the barrel with the cleaning rod. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Winter Ledge was before my time, but I read the after action." His voice was low and even. It did not carry past the two of them. He was not addressing the room. Emeka turned his head slightly to look at him, the minimum rotation necessary to bring the other man into his field of vision without turning to face him fully. Aborasade was not looking at him. He was looking at the counter. Emeka said, "When?" "Officer training," Aborasade said. "Not the full report. The summary that went into the advisory program's case files. They used it as an example. Logistics affecting operational outcome. They didn't use the name, but the operation designation was in the summary." He paused. "I knew who E. Durasinmi was before today. I didn't know you were you." He said this last sentence without the inflection of someone saying something they intend to be noticed as significant. He said it as a statement of what had been true until very recently, because it was accurate, and because Aborasade Kahindi did not say things he did not mean, and did not embellish things that did not require embellishment. Emeka nodded once. Aborasade returned his gaze to the counter. That was the whole of it. There was no more, and no more was required. Emeka understood the gesture for what it was. Not tribute, not recognition of the kind that was performed for an audience, but the acknowledgement of one man who had spent his working life inside a particular institution to another man who had been in the same institution at a different time, on the specific basis of one of them having read a document and understood what the document was describing. It was the acknowledgement of the record. It was, in its way, exactly what Emeka had come here for, though it was not what he had expected. He had not expected anything from the other people in this room. He had come for the record, not for witnesses. The witnesses were incidental to the objective, and he had not organized his expectations around them. And yet, Aborisade standing close, without making a speech about it, and Violetta typing her statement at the table without being asked, and the hunter sitting on the bench near the door without having anywhere particular to be, and the two collectors who had stopped pretending to look at the cases, all of these things were in the room, and he was registering them. In the peripheral and accurate way he registered most things. They did not change the objective. They were their own kind of correct. Nate ran a final dry patch through the bore and held the muzzle at an angle to the overhead light, looking through the bore from the chamber end with the breech open, checking the lands and grooves in the way you checked them when you wanted to be certain the bore was in the condition you said it was in. The chrome lining was intact, the rifling clear, the bore's surface carrying the modest reflection that indicated clean metal properly protected. He extracted the patch, folded the cleaning rod, set both aside. He applied the preservation oil to the exterior metal surfaces using a patch on a cotton swab, working in small sections, the gloves staying on throughout. The oil went on the barrel, the receiver, the operating rod, the trigger guard, the muzzle. He did not apply it to the areas around the serial number, working up to the edges of the stamped digits and stopping, leaving the number itself clear. He did not explain this. He simply did not oil the number. He worked the action several times after oiling, running the operating rod through its cycle slowly, feeling for the gritty resistance that had been there at the beginning of the examination. It was lighter now. The residual rust that had been creating friction between the operating rod and the receiver, reduced by the cleaning and lubrication, though not eliminated. He noted this. He said, "The operating rod's still going to have some friction. Not dangerous, not going to cause any problem in a display case. But whoever did the final cleaning before it goes in should know. It's slightly bent, and the bent section is where the contact is. It'll cycle, but it won't cycle clean." Emeka said, "I'll note it in the documentation." Nate set the operating rod back in its guide. He looked at the rifle on the mat, checking his work the way he checked everything, not performing the check, but actually looking. The complete pass of the eye over the surface that told you whether you had done what you thought you had done. He was satisfied. He removed the gloves and set them on the tray. He said, "I can print a condition assessment on shop letterhead if the memorial wants it. Serial number, physical findings, the database result, a note on the operating rod. That's an official document from a licensed gunsmith of record." Emeka said, "That would be useful." Nate turned to the terminal and spent several minutes typing the assessment. The printer under the counter made its sound, and he pulled the pages and laid them on the counter beside the photograph and reviewed them before sliding them toward Emeka. He did not hand them to him. He laid them on the glass between them so that Emeka could choose to pick them up, which he did, reading each page in the same methodical way he read manifests, left to right, then the critical numbers again right to left, checking the serial against the stamped receiver once before folding the pages along the center and placing them inside the breast pocket alongside the photograph. The breast pocket was the same one he had been touching reflexively since he arrived. The pocket that had held the photograph through the drive here, and through the conversation, and through all the time before that. The photograph went back in on top of the assessment pages, and his hand came away and the pocket was as it had been, slightly weighted, the fabric slightly shaped by what was inside. Violetta said, "I'll email you the statement tonight." Emeka said, "Thank you. His email address?" He looked at Nate. Nate said, "I'll give it to Professor Marchevka." He said it to Emeka. He looked at Violetta. "Is that all right?" She said yes. She was already typing it into her phone. The shop had been occupied by these particular people for something approaching 2 hours. The evening outside was full dark, the street light through the front windows putting a thin orange line along the bottom edge of the door frame. The overhead fluorescents continued their low hum. The refrigerator in the back room was running a degree warm. Somewhere outside, a car went past without slowing, its headlights briefly brightening the window glass and then moving on. Nate picked up the canvas slipcover that Emeka had brought the rifle in and offered it across the counter. Emeka took it and unzipped it and slid the rifle back inside with the care of a person who has handled the same object many times and knows exactly how it fits in its case. He zipped it closed, he picked it up, he was holding it again as he had been holding it when he came in, at his side, barrel pointed at the floor, the correct carry for a long gun in a public space. The slipcover's canvas was faded and worn, the kind of faded that came from years of use in varying conditions, and it occurred to Nate, watching him hold it, that the slipcover was probably as old as the search, that it had probably been bought for this specific rifle when Emeka had first obtained it from the estate lot, and had not been replaced because, why would it be replaced? It served its purpose. And Emeka was not the kind of person who replaced things that served their purpose simply because they were worn. Emeka looked at the photograph and the legal pad notes still on the counter. He said, "May I have the notes?" Nate said, "Those are yours." He picked up the photograph, turned it face down, and looked at the counter where it had been lying. There was a faint oval on the mat from the photograph's contact, the oils from the surface of an object handled many times, leaving a trace when the object was removed. He picked the mat up, examined the shape, set the mat back down. It was a thing that had been where it was and was now somewhere else, and the place it had been remembered it briefly. He slid the notes toward Emeka, who added them to the breast pocket with the same economical precision as everything else. The pocket was nearly full now. It had the look of a pocket that had been empty for a long time and was now carrying what it had been waiting to carry. Emeka put his hand flat on the counter one more time, not in the way he had put it there when he arrived, the two-handed, waiting gesture of a man who had set something down and was prepared to stand his ground about it, but in the brief, definitive way of a person who is completing a transaction. A single hand, a single flat pressure, lasting perhaps 2 seconds. He took it away. He said, "Now you know what to look for." He was looking at Nate when he said it. It was not a reprimand, and it was not a consolation, and it was not kind in the way that kindness is sometimes deployed as a softening agent for a harder statement. It was information, passed from one person to another in the tone of information, useful, specific, permanently available once received. Nate said, "Yes, sir." He said it without thinking about it. He had not used that address since his apprenticeship, where it had been the form of address for the man he was learning from, and it had come out now from the same place that things come from when they arrive without being decided on, from something below the level of deliberate speech, accurate in a way that deliberate speech often failed to be. Emeka looked at him for one moment. He nodded once. Then he picked up the rifle in its cover and turned toward the door. Aborisade stepped aside to let him pass. He did not do anything else. He simply moved, making room, the way people make room in a space for someone who is leaving. The bell above the door made its flat sound. The door closed. Through the front window, the shape of him was visible on the sidewalk for a few seconds before he moved past the frame of the window and was no longer visible. The shop was quiet. Nate stood at the counter. He looked at the counter mat. He looked at the oval the photograph had left on the mat's surface. He looked at the terminal screen, which was still showing the database result from the serial number search, the operation designation, and the dates and the name of the accountable individual in its small, clear font. He picked up the cloth he had used to wipe the receiver during his initial examination. He folded it once, lengthwise. He set it on the counter beside the mat. He picked up the legal pad and wrote Hendricks/Museum at the top of a new page and underlined it. And below that wrote follow-up/accession correction and underlined that too. He looked at the two underlines. He picked up a pen and wrote call Thursday below that and circled it. He looked at the terminal. He reached over and closed the database result and opened the work order for the Springfield 1903A3 that Garrett Deluski had left an hour ago. The trigger job, the sear engagement, the 4.5-pound clean break he had promised by end of next week. The work order had been sitting open since before Emeka had set the rifle on the counter. It was the same work order. The shop was the same shop. He was the same gunsmith who had opened in the morning. He picked up the cloth and began to clean the counter mat with the focused attention of a person who is doing a small job correctly because they have been in the recent presence of the principle that small jobs done correctly are not a different category of thing from large jobs done correctly, but only the same category at a different scale. Across the shop, Aborisade had returned to his chair. He picked up his cold coffee and looked at it and set it back down. He picked up his phone and looked at the screen for a moment, then set the phone face down on his knee and looked at the door. The memorial on Prospect was a converted carriage house attached to a civic building that had served several functions over its 120-year life and had arrived after a renovation completed in 2018 at its current function as a community archive and small exhibition space. The carriage house's main room held 6 wooden display cases of the long horizontal type, each under glass, each mounted at a height designed for comfortable standing viewing. The walls between cases held framed documents and photographs mounted in archival frames with UV filtering glass. The lighting was recessed and warm, angled to reduce glare on the glass surfaces while providing enough illumination to read placards clearly. The installation was done on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November. The volunteer who handled it was a woman named Ogechi, 29, who had been managing the archives collection for 3 years and who had received the rifle and its documentation 2 weeks earlier in a shipping case that was significantly more carefully packed than most of what came through the door. The packing included layers of archival foam precisely cut to the rifle's profile, the canvas slipcover removed and packed separately, and a set of documents in a waterproof sleeve that she had opened and read in full before she did anything else, because she had learned early that the documents were always the point, and that the object was only the document made physical. She had read the historian's statement first, then the gunsmith's condition assessment, then the correspondence file summary, then the original manifest pages, which were reproductions. The originals were in the State Archives collection as of 3 weeks ago, received with a donation letter from a man in Columbus who had provided a return address that was a post office box and a phone number that went to a voicemail that was not set up. She had read the after-action summary extract that Violetta Markevka had included, the section where the logistics advisor's field report was cited, the specific paragraph about the alternate crossing and the load-bearing assessment, and the information that had made the corridor passable. She had read it twice. She had looked at the reproduction photograph for a long time. The young man in field clothes, the rifle, the supply tent, the direct sunlight that washed the shadows flat. She had looked at his posture and his face and the way he held the rifle, and she had thought about the fact that he had been 23 years old in this photograph, which was 6 years younger than she was now, and that the thing he was holding was the thing currently packed in archival foam on her work table, and that between this photograph and this table were 65 years of time and 3 private sales and 1 fraudulent museum catalog entry and 1 research query that nobody followed up on, and 1 man's 4 years of intermittent work through property records and estate sale listings. She had thought, someone paid $240 for this. She had started the installation. The case she used was the 4th one from the entrance, on the room's north wall. She mounted the rifle on 2 acrylic supports that she positioned at the balance points so the rifle lay level and without stress on the mounting surfaces. She placed the photograph reproduction in its archival frame on the wall above the case. She laid the placard in its slot at the front of the case. The placard had been printed by the archive's standard vendor. White cardstock, black text, the archive's small seal at the bottom right. She had written the placard text herself from the documentation, and she had sent it to a member of the archive's advisory board for review before submission to the printer, because the advisory board reviewed all placard text, and because this one in particular she had not wanted to get wrong. The text read, M14 National Match Rifle, serial number, issued to Logistics Advisor Emeka Durosinmi, Captain Equivalent, Exchange Assignment, Firebase Kestrel, Military Region 3, Republic of Vietnam, 1968. Last confirmed property entry, October 16th to 18th, 1968. Operation Winter Ledge. Donated by Emeka Durosinmi, 2026. She had placed a period after each line. She had verified the serial number against 3 separate documents before she submitted the text to the printer, including the rifle itself, checking the stamp digits against the printed digits on the proof copy with the kind of care that she would have applied regardless, but that she applied more consciously here because of the specific history of the number and what had happened when people had failed to look at it carefully. She had checked it twice. The placard sat in its slot. The rifle sat on its supports. The photograph looked down from above the case at the level of someone standing at a comfortable viewing distance. The light came from the recessed fixture above the case and touched the rifle's receiver at the angle that the lighting was designed to achieve, which was the angle that gave the best visibility of the surface detail, the condition of the metal, the depth of the patina, the particular quality of a surface that had been through time and weather and decades of inadequate storage and had emerged from all of it with its essential information intact. The serial number on the receiver sat in its stamped channels, oxidized and pitted in the character of the surrounding metal, but clearly legible under the lighting. The digits in their sequence just as they had been in a supply tent before dawn in October of 1968, just as they had been on a manifest page under a red-filtered angle head lamp, just as they had been on a flashlight-lit counter in a gun shop on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 2026. Ogechi stood back. She looked at the placard. The serial number on the placard was the same serial number on the receiver. She had checked it twice. She had always been going to check it twice. She did not know, checking it, that the man who had last signed for this rifle had made the same check 68 years before her and had developed the habit from an instruction he received from his superior officer in an office in Lagos, and that the habit had outlasted the man's professional life and had survived into the moment when the habit mattered most. She only knew that the number was correct. She switched off the work light, gathered her tools, and left the carriage house through the side door. The morning was cold and bright, the November sky over the street the particular washed blue that came after a frost, and her breath made a small cloud in the air when she stepped outside. The carriage house door closed behind her. Inside, in the case, the serial number on the placard was what it had always been.